For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow, and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This ends the reading of the scripture.
Years ago, there was a movie starring Albert Brooks entitled Defending Your Life. I don't know how many of you have seen that movie, but the movie is about mainly Albert Brooks, who even as a child was always afraid. He lived in fear. He was bullied as a child. He never thought of himself as having any real worth or value. And so by the time he got to be an adult, he was still living under that same fear, trying not to be noticed and not ever really speaking out for his own worth. So one day we see that he's practicing in the mirror that he's going to ask his boss for a raise, but he really just can't do it because he's afraid. But he goes in, he says he's not going to accept anything under this amount, and the boss offers him a certain amount, and he doesn't even think about it. He just accepts whatever amount the boss says. But he's not entirely bad with himself. He's going to get himself a new vehicle because he feels like he deserves something special. So he buys a BMW convertible. Now this happens in Los Angeles. And so the day that he goes to pick up this convertible, the salesman, who's a friend of his, gives him a new CD, a Barbra Streisand CD. He puts the Streisand CD into his car with the top down on this beautiful sunny California day and starts driving until he drops the CD cover onto the floor. And so he bends down to reach for it. And he looks up and there's a truck. The next scene occurs in a different place, in heaven. Well, it's not really heaven. In this movie, it's a place that's sort of in between heaven and, well, where you go if you don't go there. It's a little different than our understanding of what heaven and hell is about. You see, it seems that the purpose of the universe is so that we learn and we grow and we expand so that we can then go forth into the universe to learn even more. That's the premise there. And the idea of defending your life is that once you're there in this kind of middle ground place, you are actually on trial. You and your life are on trial. And you have a prosecutor and you have a defender. A public defender is given to him. And so they're going to look at 3 scenes from his life that show that he should move on. He's graduated from earth to the universe and beyond. But the prosecutor wants to convict him. And when you're convicted there, you're sent back to earth. That's your punishment. You have to come back here. Doesn't sound so bad, does it? Well, the prosecutor is convinced that Albert Brooks' character should not move on in the universe because he has failed to overcome fear in his life. That fear has really destroyed his life. And maybe you've heard the saying before that a life lived in fear is a life half lived. Well, he's only been living half a life, so how could he graduate to the next, according to this prosecutor? And so one of the scenes that she shows, and you can see your life on the big screen here in this particular movie, shows a scene when he was a young man. He had graduated college, he'd been out for many years, and he had saved $10,000 that he wanted to invest in the stock market. And so he's sitting with some friends from college. And one of his friends happens to be from Japan. He was one of his good friends in college. And his Japanese friend's involved in a new company in Japan. And it's a watch company. And so he says, if you invest your $10,000 into this watch company, you could make a ton of money. And he said, wait a minute, a Japanese watch company? That's never going to work. The Japanese don't know how to make watches. Now you bring to me a Swiss company, and I'm all in with the $10,000. And so then the prosecutor says, and what was the name of that company? Casio. Casio, the biggest watch company in the world. And if you had invested your $10,000 into that company, you would have made millions of dollars. And then slamming down, protesting is his defender, who says, well, I was going to use this scene to show why he deserves to go forward because this man has shown restraint. Restraint. Well, I can't help but think of that scene when I think about the poor third person in this story. And I'm not going to use the slave master thing because that can get us down the wrong path. So we're simply going to say a boss and workers. The boss and the workers. Everybody's had a boss, and we've all been workers in some way. Even if we are our own boss, we're all workers too. So this story really hits home for a lot of us. And which of these employees do you most align with? Which one kind of resonates with you the most? Is it the first one? The master, the boss, comes and says, you know what, I've got so much confidence in you that I'm going to give you 5 talents. And just for a frame of reference, 1 talent is worth 20 years of your work in money. 20 years of your work is 1 talent. 5 talents is 100 years worth of work. That's a lot. He must have a lot of faith in this first employee. And then the second employee, he also has faith. And he gives 2 talents. Not cheap, 2 talents. How much would 2 be? That's 40 years. 40 years worth of your life in terms of money. And to the third, he gives 1 talent. 20 years. 20 years of your blood, sweat, and tears. 20 years. It's a long time. 20 years. Now, what is it that the first 2 servants have, the first 2 employees have, that the third employee doesn't have? They seem to have confidence. Or maybe a better word than confidence is gratitude. They seem to have an attitude of gratitude. They don't look at getting this money as a curse, as a negative thing. For them, it's an opportunity. For them, it's a blessing. And they probably think, wow, look at our boss. Our boss has a lot of faith in us. Look at what they've entrusted us with. This is a good thing. Now, there's been a lot of brain science done on the issue of gratitude and anxiety. And what scientists have discovered is that in your mind, if you're focused on gratitude, then anxiety and fear cannot coexist. That is, it can't take the space. That the way our minds work is if you have gratitude in your mind, you can't have anxiety. You can't have fear. But guess what? If you have anxiety and fear in your mind, you can't have gratitude. They don't coexist. You can have one or the other. You can live in your boss's joy, or you can have the other. The one that, sadly, many of us probably relate to. The third employee. You know, the one who's just too afraid. How many of you have taken risk in the stock market and then been bitten? My poor father believed that he was cursed when it came to making money. And he had some evidence of being cursed. Family sold the family farm. They discovered oil on it after they sold it. And that is still pumping. Yeah, that one stings a bit. Now, my father summed it up by simply saying, well, that's just typical Taylor luck. My father invested heavily in General Motors, biggest company in the world. He also worked for General Motors, so a lot of his stocks and his retirement was in General Motors. Going to ride that one into retirement. Had a few scary moments there. One time, there was a guy in church who was an investment person who got other guys in church to invest in him. That did not end well. Typical Taylor luck was my dad's thinking. And at the end of my dad's life, I've mentioned this to you before, but at the end of his life, just days before he would die, he was just kind of reminiscing and thinking about his life, and all he was doing was thinking about the investments in his life that didn't work. How much more he could have made of his life. Now, some of us may do that. Maybe you do that. You get that negative voice going. You live more in the fear, in the anxiety of the undone. Why does that servant, that employee, bury that talent? Why? Why do we? Because we're afraid. We live in fear. Whether we're individuals or even as a church, we bury our talent because we're afraid. What if we lose it? What if we make a mistake? We lose it. Now, I looked at my father's life, and I didn't see a life half-lived. I saw a full life, not one lived in fear. My dad was in the Air Force. He served during the Korean War in Vietnam. He was brave. He flew with bullets flying around his plane. He flew in that. That shows strength. That shows courage. My father invested in people, in his family, in his extended family, in his church family, in community. My father knew nothing about baseball but volunteered to be an umpire for my little league. Yes, he invested. And I'm so sorry that at the very end, even though I told him differently, all he could do was bury that treasure in that particular moment. What a joy it must have been for those first two employees when the boss came back. Can you imagine how they felt? Doing really well like that. What'd you do? They bring him the talents, and the first one, who had 5 talents, doubled it. How many years is that? 200 years? 200 years of salary? Well done, good and faithful servant. You may enter into my joy. And then the second, 2 talents became 4. 80 years is pretty good. 80 years of salary? well done, good and faithful servant, you might enter into my joy. And then we come up there empty-handed. Well, we're not empty. We got a talent, and we made sure we cleaned all the dirt off of it because it was buried, and we give it to the boss, and here you go. And then we say, I was too afraid. You know, you're really harsh. You're a very critical person. And I was afraid to disappoint you, so I buried it. And we know the response was one of anger and disappointment. I have a colleague who was preaching a sermon about the impact of negativity and gratitude. We also know that when you have gratitude in your mind and in your heart, you don't have a space for negative or for anxiety or fear. However, we know in studying brains that one negative comment is more powerful than 5 affirmations or 5 positive comments. So he thought he would put it to the test during a sermon, and he asked his wife if she wouldn't mind being a volunteer. Okay, she said. She didn't know exactly what was going to happen. His wife was sitting up in the front, and he pays his wife 5 incredible compliments. You know, honey, you have the most beautiful eyes. You have the most beautiful hair. What a beautiful person you are. You're always such a positive person, a great mother, just a great voice singing in the choir. No problem coming up with these 5 things. And she was floating off of the pew as he said those things. But then he was loading up for that fastball, the negative. Now, his wife happened to love purple. How many of you love purple? Love to wear purple. She loved purple. And he said to her, she was wearing purple. And he said, honey, I know you love purple, but honey, purple's just not your color. You don't look good in purple. Now, I know some of you know the phrase doghouse. Somebody is being sent to the doghouse today, and the entire congregation did what you did. What? You might think things like that, but you never say them out loud. Didn't you go to the man's club? Shut up. You know. But no, he said it out loud. But then he made his point. After all the eyes were staring at him, he said, now, honey, can you name those 5 positive things I said about you? And guess how many she could name? 1. 1. She could only think of 1 positive comment because that negative wiped out everything else. How many of you have had that happen? Throw a great Thanksgiving meal, get all the family together. Isn't it wonderful? And your kid said, Mom, this is such a great meal, but next year, all the air goes right out. Isn't it horrible? 1 comment. You know, I'll get that. Hey, Pastor, that was a great service, but those are the things you focus on. We focus on the negative. We focus on the scarcity, not the abundance. Now, the first 2 employees focused on the abundance. They focused on the abundance, on gratitude. While the 3rd employee, the one that we may most relate to, because we know all those things. We remember Benjamin Franklin's wisdom, a fool and his money are soon parted. We know about those kinds of things. We're afraid. And fear has a place. Negative thoughts actually have a place in the evolutionary background. Apparently, when we were cavemen and women, we needed to store up negative thoughts. They needed to have an important place in us. Why? Because it kept us alive. That's a poisonous plant. A negative reaction to that, you got to remember that. This is a place where we get attacked by lions. We got to remember that. So it had a purpose. But we're not living in caves anymore. It had its purpose. It doesn't now. We have to invest. And so the employer says to the employee, you could have at least put it in the bank and I would have made 1% on it. But you didn't even do that. And then it doesn't end well. Now back to the holding tank where poor Albert Brooks was being held in trial, defending his life. How do you think it went for him? Well, he lost his case, and he was going to get sent back to earth and have to do it all over again. It was a moment where he felt like he was being held back in school. You got to repeat that grade. How embarrassed he was that all the friends he had made up in this new place, they were getting on a train to go further into the universe, and he's going back home. You're held back. You feel less. And he was afraid even more until, spoiler alert, he overcame his fear. You see, the other main character in that particular movie was played by Meryl Streep, who was the polar opposite of him as a person. She lived her life fearless. And the way she died was she jumped in to save somebody else's life and in the process lost her own. But he fell in love with her while they were in this space together. And he sees her getting on the train to go into the new universe, and he decides, I don't care what the universe says, I'm going to go for it, and he goes for it. He gets electrocuted, but hey, what's love? And he goes for it and finally gets to her. And then he doesn't realize that the prosecutor and the defender and the judge are watching all of this take place. And the defender says to the prosecutor, do you see? He's ready. He's ready. Got to have a happy ending. It was Hollywood. What's your happy ending? What's your happy ending when it comes to the gifts and the talents that God has given you? What's our happy ending with the gifts and talents that God gives us? How do we invest? We invest in gratitude. That's what we plant in our hearts and in our minds. We say no to negativity. Now, there's always going to be something negative in the world around us. We're always going to hear it. There's not going to be a single person in the state of Ohio that's going to hear more negativity this week than Ryan Day as he gets ready for the big game in Michigan. Or how about the Cleveland Browns having to decide about this new freshman rookie quarterback that's going to lead them to victory over the Steelers? We'll see. I listen to the fans. They're so negative. Cleveland's almost in first place, and it's like, oh, the sky is falling. We're doomed. And I got to tell you, the Buckeye boards are not that different. They win 11 games, and it's like, oh, we're terrible. We can't win. And the Michigan fans are the same. It's us against the world. You focus on all the negative. And yet, we're grateful that we have this game. We're grateful that we have this life. It's hard to push off the negative. Our instinct is to bury it. Our instinct is to bury it. But then we're told that that leads to gnashing of teeth. And then we get that last bit of formula for us to mull over as we make a decision whether we want to have a life and a head full of gratitude or scarcity, anxiety, and fear. To those who have much, more will be given. But to those who have less, even more will be taken. That doesn't sound fair. But neither does filling our head with negative thoughts. So let's invest in the better. If we know that we have a sure investment, if you're sitting across the table from your Japanese friend that says, hey, my family's making these watches, and you can invest in this, and you can do really well, then you ought to do it. And that's what God is telling us today. Investing in us is investing in God. Investing in St. Peter's is investing in God, in God's kingdom. And to those who have much, more will be given, but to those who have less, more will be taken.